We can now turn to Exodus chapter 3, which will be our text for today. This, of course, is the famous account of the burning bush where God appears to Moses. Exodus chapter 3, page 46 of your Pew Bible, if you have one. Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses! And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, so that when you leave you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold, and for clothing which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians. Thus far the reading of Exodus chapter 3. Brothers and sisters, Exodus 3 is a powerful and vivid chapter. I think my role today is less to say things about it and more to draw you into the chapter and its story, for the story itself was powerful and vivid. It's one of the foundational stories of Western civilization, I would even say. Both the Christianity and the Jewish religion also are heavily influenced by the burning bush and what it means. And so I'm going to begin just by starting with the text, and we're going to walk through the text verse by verse as much as we can. And I want to bring it to you as it should be. Let's begin with verse 1. In verse 1, we see that Moses is tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Now, just as a bit of review from previous weeks, it's been a few weeks since we've talked about Exodus. Remember, Moses is raised in the household of Pharaoh, but he is a Hebrew. He's one of the slaves of Egypt. Moses, of course, saw one of his own people suffering under a slave driver. He beats up and kills the slave driver. Unfortunately, this crime is discovered. His own people do not receive it well and spurn him, and Pharaoh puts a death sentence on his head. And Moses has fled to Midian in the Sinai Peninsula. He's taken in by the family of Jethro and marries one of Jethro's daughters. And from other parts of Scripture, we learn that Moses had spent 40 years as a shepherd in Midian before the burning bush. He spends 40 years until he leaves Egypt, and then there's another 40 years before the burning bush. He's 80 years old at this point. And this verse is interesting because it shows us that in those 40 years, Moses has not become wealthy, unlike the previous patriarchs. Moses is tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. Moses has been reduced to the highest position in Egypt, the highest honor, to a lowly shepherd of his father-in-law's sheep in Midian. The point being, in verse 1, Moses is a nobody. He has gone from greatness to the bottom. And especially in Egypt, being a shepherd is the lowliest of things. And Moses is not just a shepherd, but a poor shepherd. He spends all of his time in the desert, in the heat. It's uncomfortable, it's dusty. And we see here that at some point he's leading the flock to the far side of the wilderness. He comes to Horeb, the mountain of God. This is later on Mount Sinai. And then something incredible happens to this lowliest of men. Most defeated. We can imagine at this point that Moses has given up any possibility of ever being helpful to his people. He's resigned himself to die as a shepherd. Except, verse 2, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. Man, so many questions. God, why would God do this? Why is God appearing to Moses in the desert? In a bush that's burning. And it says here, there is the angel of the Lord. What is the angel of the Lord? The Hebrew word simply means messenger. It can be an angel, a divine being, or it could be an image or representation of God himself. Some scholars have argued that the angel of the Lord is Jesus, is the Son of God. Maybe. Whatever it is, it seems to be God himself is appearing to Moses with the imagery of an angel. And second, what is this burning bush? What's the purpose of this? Is this just a way to get Moses' attention, or is there a little more to this image? I want to say two things here. First, notice that the fire is burning the bush, but it's not consuming it. Why? The point is that God is in the bush, and God is an inexhaustible fire who does not require fuel. God is the creator, the source of all things. He has limitless energy. And it later points to the name later that he gives of himself. His later name is I am. In other words, I exist. I'm the arche, the logos, the creator, the initiator, the cause of all things. I am the fuel of all things. I don't need fuel. It's a powerful revelation of who God is versus the pagan gods. In a pagan temple, if you wanted to burn a sacrifice, you had to bring the fire. Later on, Elijah will reveal this at Mount Carmel, where fire comes from heaven to burn Elijah's sacrifice. Secondly, God calls to Moses from the bush. And then in verse 5, God says something fascinating. He says, "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." And here's a new layer. This is the first time in the Old Testament where holiness begins to emerge as an idea. That God is holy. God is called blameless earlier by Abraham, but now holy. What is this? It's a massive theme in Exodus. We'll come to it in time. But what is this holiness? How can God be holy? Well, holiness, brothers and sisters, is what we would call the holy, transcendental otherness of God. It's a transcendental purity and righteousness of God. It's almost what we could call God's essential quality, what makes him God in a way. You see, unlike the other gods of the time in Egypt, which were basically humans with superpowers, God is entirely transcendent and beyond human existence, and so righteous and holy that nothing can exist that is sinful. And he's almost unfathomably beyond human comprehension. And the way God reveals this to us, it's almost beyond words what holiness is. But the way it's revealed is with fire. And this is why we read the other texts. Exodus 19, verse 18, it says, Mount Sinai, later on when God gives the law to God's people, God descends on Mount Sinai in that scene in what? Mount Sinai was covered with smoke. The Lord descended on it in fire. Deuteronomy 4, verse 24, Moses says to the people of Israel, "For the Lord your God is a consuming fire." And we also read Ezekiel 1, verse 27, where Ezekiel is given an image or a vision of who God is. And what is God in that image? He's sitting on the throne. Who is he? Appeared from his waist, he looked like a glowing metal, listen, as if full of fire. And that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. The point is, brothers and sisters, is twofold. One, fire is always pure. You cannot contaminate fire. Anything that tries to contaminate fire is burnt by the fire or puts the fire out potentially. And secondly, fire is extremely powerful. Fire will consume and destroy anything in its path. It is the most powerful thing, except water, but God's fire cannot be quenched. God's holiness is like that. He cannot be contaminated by anything that's not righteous. And the power of his fire consumes anything that would dare stand against him. And he's the most powerful fire in the universe. He cannot be quenched. It's 100% pure. And brothers and sisters, part of what the burning bush reveals to us is that God is so beyond our human comprehension in his incredibly pure righteousness. I don't think we in this church and in this culture as a whole, myself included, I don't think we grasp how dangerous God is. You see, if Moses walks too close to God in his holiness, Moses will be burnt to a crisp instantaneously. He has to take off his sandals. And man, if he did not choose to do that, we can only imagine what would have happened. This is a God, brothers and sisters, who can burn an entire nation to a crisp in an instant. I mean, you've seen Pompeii, where a volcano erupts and poof, it's gone. Even in the Bible, hell is revealed as an entire realm full of God's wrath demonstrated as fire. Can you imagine an entire realm of the universe filled with fire? Now, we don't know if that's exactly what hell is. It's a representation. And it's illuminating to see that Moses does not even dare look at God. That's part of that was cultural at the time. People never looked at gods at that time. But he's afraid. There's a sense in which, brothers and sisters, that when we first approach God, that we have a holy fear. The Bible talks often of the fear of the Lord. Why? And Moses is afraid at first. And actually, we also read Isaiah 6, and we read about God revealing himself to Moses or to Isaiah and commissioning the prophet Isaiah. And what does Isaiah say when he sees the glory of God? Look what he says. He says, "Woe to me, I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. I'm dead. I cannot be in the presence of this God." Same with Ezekiel. Look what happens to Ezekiel. "This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of the one speaking." Ezekiel's terrified. He falls flat to the ground. If God revealed himself in his full glory to us right now, all of us would fall down, face down on the floor in holy terror. We would be blubbering masses on the floor. How can fragile, tiny, sinful me stand in the presence of actual holy God? I was thinking about what this must feel like. I remember when I used to work on a dairy farm. On that farm, we had a bull in the cattle, or in the cows, one bull. If you know anything about Holstein bulls, they're huge and they're mean. They're notoriously mean. This bull in the barn weighed 1,500 pounds. This bull spent his entire life looking for an opportunity to smash me against a wall. He hated anything that interfered with his little realm of the barn. Anytime you would walk among the cows, he would snort and bellow and get all lathered up and start pawing his feet and look out for a way to smash you down to the... You had dared to enter his domain. Every now and then I'd walk around a corner and it would just be me and him, and man, if I didn't jump fast, that thing would smash me so quick. Many farmers have been killed by the bull in the barn. And I express this because even today I have vivid memories of the fear I felt in those moments where you had to jump out of the pen, otherwise you were dead. I mean, and that kind of fear that penetrates to the bottom of your heart, you don't shake it easily. Your soul is a bit affected by it. It's sort of a mediocre illustration, but this is the sort of fear Moses feels at the burning bush. This is the fear Ezekiel and Isaiah felt. You're in the room with a being that is so beyond, so much more powerful than your mind can grasp, and so you're pancake. You got nothing. And brothers and sisters, I think we need a little more of that in North America. The truth is, brothers, the truth is, we don't like feeling this fear, and that's why we try to avoid it. One of the reasons we don't want to read our Bible is because we really don't want to think about a God like this existing. And often we try to avoid the holiness of God with two things. One, we try to overemphasize how holy we could be. So God's holiness should not be threatening to me because I've worked really hard to be holy. I can stand in his presence. course, we forget that holiness only belongs to God, but it's sort of his identity, in a sense. So the only way humans can become holy is if God gives them holiness. We are not holy, brothers and sisters, unless we belong to God. So no, you can't minimize God's holiness by suggesting that somehow you're holy enough to stand in his presence, unless, of course, you've become a Christian. Even then, you have no right to stand in his presence other than the right he gives you through his own gift. And, it's in the Bible, people often misread the Bible on this point. We think the Bible is about salvation. It is not. The Bible is the story of how God is going to make us all holy enough to dwell in his presence. Perfectly holy. And the Bible is a story of how God saves us so that we might be made holy and to live in his holy kingdom, praising him in his holiness and gazing at the beauty of his glory all the time. If you think that salvation is enough, you are missing the point. And nobody has, or maybe you've avoided it, or you're failing to see the glory of your God. It's not enough to barely make it into heaven. No. That's the first thing. The second thing, we attempt to deal with God's holiness often is to try minimize God's holiness. It's so tempting for us to domesticate God and to lower him down, to try to explain him. This is why God hates it when people make images of him. God says, I can't be confined to an image. I'm holy. This is also what blasphemy is in the third commandment. God says, you're treating my name as if it's nothing. Don't do that. You don't understand me if you do that. God says, I will not hold him guiltless who misuses my name or who treats my name as if it's nothing. Why? Because if you think God's name is nothing, you are deeply guilty of misunderstanding God and disrespecting him. And you're just lying to yourself. All you need to do in order to punch through this lowering of God is to read the Exodus 19, and you read about how God appeals to Israel in his glory. He terrifies an entire nation of millions of people. You cannot minimize this man, this God. And so, brothers and sisters, our first point ends like this. God is holy. And in the first place, you got to have some fear of that. Especially if you don't want Jesus. God can consume you in an instant. Poof. Weep with terror. Just feel it for a second. Then the good news. And our second point, Moses' commission. You see, the beauty of Exodus chapter 3 is that God has not come to destroy Moses, but to love him. Holy God. Holy, transcendent God is what? He's going to speak to Moses and commission him for a task. Look at God describes himself. First of all, God calls to Moses in verse 4, and he says, Moses, Moses is a term of endearment. He treats Moses like a friend, like a son. I mean, the juxtaposition of the holiness of God and this love of God is almost too much to understand, but it's there. Moses says, here I am. Then God introduces himself to Moses. Look what he says. How does he do it? Look what he says. I am the God of your father, Amram, this is Moses' father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God, unlike all of the gods of Egypt, there was Ra, the sun god, there was all the other gods, which all were defined by their power. No, God introduces himself through and as a relational God. His self-definition is who he's loved. He defines himself by the people he cares for. This is a God who's defined by his relationships. And so here we begin to realize that the holy fear that we feel in God's presence can easily turn into love very quickly, and this massive sense of relief. God's not here. The burning bush is not God about to destroy Moses. No, it's God about to love him. And we can feel the same. Not by ignoring God's holiness, but by seeing it and then appreciating the love. And now look at God continues. He says, look, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. So God, remember, he sees. He sees us. Holy God, I have heard them crying out. I'm listening to you, to your people. And I am concerned. In other words, I know their suffering. I feel it. So, verse 8, I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. Look at, I am coming down out of heaven, out of the place where I dwell in holy radiance. I'm going to enter human affairs and the mess of it, and I am going to deliver the people and raise them up. And I am going to bring them into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. You know, these are the two richest things in the ancient world, honey and milk. Oh, this is the good life. And then the home of these other nations. The cry of the Israelites has reached me. I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. You can see here the kind of God that's talking to Moses, holy, and yet his heart is invested in the people he loves. And the words that are used here, they're like together, they make the case that all of God is in this. That all of his senses, his heart is invested. And so, brothers and sisters, what's the upshot of this burning bush? That God's holiness is not here to consume us, but to be with us. It's a fire that exists to protect us and deliver us from people who would hurt us. This holiness is on our side. It's for us. God's fire has become grace. Right, we read Psalm 18. In that psalm, David starts the psalm by saying, this is my God has delivered me. And then he speaks about the fire of God and how the fire of God has issued from God to save David. So now God in all of his glory and might and majesty is on our side. And then David can say, I love you, Lord, my strength. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge. Holy God is my God. Now, when you read a chapter like this, the most relevant question at this point ought to be, how is it that holy God can be united to you and me and we don't die instantly? How can God allow sinful Moses, murderer Moses, to stand in front of him without smiting him down? This is the puzzling part of the whole chapter. And brothers and sisters, this is a very clear arrow that points us to Jesus, doesn't it? Because Jesus later dies. This is Exodus, is the whole book of Exodus, Leviticus, the whole Pentateuch is pointing us forward to Jesus. Now Jesus makes all of this salvation possible. Jesus is going to take on a human body. He's going to be the Son of God. He's going to give up his glory. He's not going to come as fire to earth. He's going to come as a human. He's going to die to pay the penalty we deserve for our sin. And through Jesus Christ, the righteous, holy fire of God is going to fall on Jesus. God himself is going to take the fire of God. Jesus is going to endure hell, so to speak. The all-consuming fire will fall on him. And therefore, through his sacrifice, none of us will have to suffer the holiness of God as it's directed at us to consume us. And so in Jesus Christ, God can then say to us, do not fear. I am not here to harm you, but to bless you. Only through Jesus is that possible. Because without Jesus, you ought to be terribly afraid and shaking in your boots. But in Jesus, the love of God drives out fear, and we feel peace. Now, Moses doesn't know a lot of this yet, and so he still has fear. He's meeting God for the first time, and you can see the fear doesn't go away so quickly. In fact, in chapter 4, we're going to see how Moses' fear and lack of courage are kind of an issue and worthy of investigation, but we'll leave that for next week. But nonetheless, it's our final point. Moses is commissioned. Why? So in verse 10, so now go, God says, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. This will be the sign that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Or it's this very mountain. And so Moses asks, of course, the relevant question, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? So Moses agrees with God. Yes, God, please deliver the Israelites. And it's amazing that God commissions Moses to save. That's the kind of God we have. By the way, I wonder if every one of us, in a sense, is commissioned that way. Well, next week we'll talk more about that. But who am I to go to Pharaoh? And just a little bit on this. Moses is 80 years old. Is an 80-year-old man going to be sent to save the people? Makes me wonder, we have some 80-year-old members of this church. What might be in your future? We'll leave it with you. But also, Moses has spent 40 years shepherding. He's long ago given up hope. How can this man possibly be useful to God? What about his wife and kids? What about them? And God's answer is so simple, especially in the Hebrew. It's so simple. God's answer is simply, I will be with you. That's it. That's the only answer Moses gets. But if you think about it, it's probably more than enough that the God of the burning bush is with you. If the God can do this, maybe we ought to be comforted by the fact that if he's with me, I think I can pretty much do anything. You see, the fear of the Lord, brothers and sisters, when we see Jesus and when we see the love of God, can be very quickly turned to courage when we realize that God is with us and not against us. Again, more on that next week. But God also gives Moses a sign, although it doesn't seem very helpful. The sign to you that is, when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Doesn't seem like a very helpful sign. The people will worship God on Mount Sinai in the future. I mean, that hasn't happened yet, so how can that give me faith in the present? There's a little more to this, actually. This sentence is constructed very carefully. It's constructed as, it's basically saying, you will lead the Egyptian or the Israelites out of Egypt. And then there's the word that we spoke about a few weeks ago, ha'avadim, the word for slavery. And then there's on this holy mountain. So in other words, what God is really saying to Moses is, the sign to you that I am here is that the Israelites will be liberated from slavery and they will begin to serve God. The fact that that will happen will show you that I am in this. In other words, something impossible, Moses, is going to occur. And when you see the impossible occurring, you will know it must be me. Finally, Moses then asks God for his name. Very common in ancient times, there's something called a theophany. People meet God, God gives the person instructions. This happens with other gods and other religions too. And a common feature of that is that the person asks the God for his name. Why? Well, because if you're in Egypt, there's like 15 or 20 gods, and so you better make sure you know which one is talking to you in the vision. So this is a natural thing to ask. But the way God answers Moses shows that God is greater than all the other gods. His answer is, he says, I am who I am. And in the rest of the Bible, when you see the Lord, you'll see it in the next verse 15. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord. And the Lord is there in capital letters. It's not Lord, it's actually Yahweh. It's I am. It's God's name. God's name is simply to be, or I am. And it's kind of shortened a little bit in the Hebrew. And that's what God's name is throughout the whole Old Testament. And that's what's translated as the Lord. The Jews would never dared to say Yahweh. They felt God's name was too holy, so they would always translate it as the Lord. That's why we have it that way. And this is where the name is given. And this name is powerful because it essentially, God is essentially saying, I don't have a name. I cannot be defined by any other thing other than myself. I am beyond all reference points. I am underneath all things. I am the beginning of all things. The only thing that can ever really be said about God is that he exists. Of course, the Bible teaches us more about God, but in the first place, I exist. I am. And if you think about it, if God had named himself any other name, he would not be worthy of our worship. At least in the Old Testament, at least in the first place. In the New Testament, God is called Father. Why? Well, because his Son has been revealed. There's a reference point that's him. That's God. God can name himself against himself, you see? But in the Old Testament, we don't have that yet. And so God just says, I am. It's so profound, it boggles the mind. God can't name himself against the sun or the moon because he created them. He's on top. He's underneath. He's beyond. Of course, then God does define himself relationally, which is extremely powerful. I am has united himself to your fathers, Moses. So I am as my name, but I've also been being revealed through my love for real people. That's why we call God a covenant God. Covenant simply means a formal relationship. So God has chosen to live with us in world history through relationships that are formalized by promises. It is an unbelievably shocking thing that Holy I Am would also say, I am Grace Canadian Reformed Church's God. I am Moses' God. I am Eric Onderwater's God. I don't deserve the right to that label. How can a being so powerful have that kind of love and care for me? You have to wonder how Moses is turning this over in his head. He doesn't know a ton about God. He doesn't have the Bible like we do. Only has pieces of it really at this point. He's thinking, whoa, who is this? What's so beautiful, brothers and sisters, is that God then, and we'll finish with this, commissions Moses to save his nation. God offers his power to Moses. Really. Moses, you're being commissioned to save my people, just as God later commissions Jesus to save the whole earth. The fact that holy God would make it his purpose to come and save you is an astonishing thing. That Jesus himself would come down for the purpose of saving you You see, Jesus is perfectly complete in existing for his own glory. He's an inexhaustible fuel. He does not require you. He doesn't need you. And yet chooses to give all of that to bless us. And we're going to see in the rest of the chapter, and we'll get to that more in future chapters, future sermons, the chapter is about how God exactly is going to save his people and bless them. And he's thought deeply about this. So brothers and sisters, today I want you to see holy God, that you might worship him and not fear him, really. Although I think it's helpful to fear the Lord in the sense of having a healthy reverence and respect for him. But then to be overwhelmed with his love, knowing that he forgives you. He does not come before you saying, he doesn't come to Moses and say, Moses, when you get this good, then I'll use you. No, Moses has been devastated in the desert. He's become humble. Yes. But God is going to do the saving, not Moses in the end. The same with every one of us. We have courage in this life, and we have peace in this life and joy because the fire of the Holy Lord goes before us. That's the way. That's the power. And God will consume anything that gets in his path. Man, that's a relief. You aren't going to save anyone, but God will, and maybe through you. So let us be commissioned by Christ to reveal this God to the world. If we feel unworthy of that task, then just consider the one thing. Jesus repeated this promise in Matthew 28. Jesus says to his apostles in Matthew 28, "Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." And there it is, the same promise given again for the New Testament church. God is with us, this God. Let us bow before him in worship. Amen.